Johnny Depp's voice trembled slightly as he peeled back layers that had long been hidden behind eccentric characters and public controversies. Sitting in a rustic armchair, surrounded by the soft hum of nature rather than the buzz of cameras, he appeared unburdened for the first time in years. "Hollywood doesn't reward authenticity," he said, gazing out over the hills beyond his retreat. "It feeds off of reinvention, sure, but only within the confines of what sells. And if your pain can be turned into currency, they'll do it, over and over again." The pain he referred to wasn't just metaphorical, it was lived, breathed, and endured. Depp spoke of the emotional toll of constantly having to guard his inner world while the outer world dissected every move he made. For decades, he performed a balancing act between artistic integrity and commercial demand, all while shouldering the weight of public scrutiny and private despair. He shared a particularly heartbreaking anecdote from the mid-90s, a time when his name was on every marquee, but his spirit was quietly withering. After back-to-back roles in films that did little to feed his creative hunger, he began self-medicating, using substances not to chase a high, but to escape a deep, gnawing emptiness. "I wasn't partying," he clarified. "I was drowning, in a silence no one could hear. They called it rebellion, but it was more like survival." It was during this period that Depp began gravitating toward roles that were increasingly bizarre, layered, and transformative. Each character became an alter ego, a way to channel pain into something meaningful. Edward Scissorhands, Ichabod Crane, Hunter S. Thompson. Those weren't just roles. They were lifelines, he said. Each one gave me permission to feel something real in a world that felt completely manufactured. Depp also reflected on the loneliness that fame often brings, a loneliness not of solitude, but of isolation in plain sight. He described walking through film sets and premieres, surrounded by people yet feeling invisible, misunderstood, or simply commodified. "There were moments when I felt like a product being passed around rather than a person being seen," he said. His voice cracked as he recalled the disconnect between public perception and personal reality. "The fans, they saw a rogue, a rebel, but I wasn't strong. I wasn't brave. I was broken in ways I didn't even understand yet." What made his confession all the more powerful was the quiet defiance in his tone. He wasn't bitter. He wasn't blaming others. He was reclaiming a narrative long stolen by tabloid studios and the endless churn of celebrity gossip. "I am not telling this story because I want sympathy," he said softly. "I'm telling it because it's mine. And for the first time in a long time, I think I'm ready to live it truthfully." His words, heavy with reflection but light with liberation, marked a turning point, not just for him as a performer, but as a man finally at peace with his scars. Depp's voice grew quieter, more reflective, as he delved deeper into the emotional toll his life in the spotlight had taken on his role as a father. The guilt he carried for Lily Rose and Jack was not performative or vague, it was raw and deeply internalized. He spoke of missed moments, birthdays he couldn't attend, and the torment of seeing his children's names tangled in headlines meant to destroy him. "There were days I couldn't look them in the eye," he admitted. "Not because I was ashamed of who I was, but because I knew what they had to endure, because of who I had become in the eyes of the world." He described feeling paralyzed by the knowledge that his choices, or more accurately, the media's obsession with distorting those choices, had stained their innocence. "You try to shield them," he said, his fingers twitching slightly as if grasping for something invisible. "But how do you protect someone from a storm that you, unintentionally, are the center of?" He described how he'd retreat into his characters, not for the art, but for the escape. The more unstable his real life became, the more surreal his film roles grew. Playing the absurd, the grotesque, the fantastical, it all allowed him to disappear into personas that bore none of the real-world pain he was experiencing. "Jack Sparrow wasn't just a pirate," he said. "He was a mirror ball, reflecting everything but never revealing anything true." The transformation into those characters became a sort of armor, a way to avoid confronting the father he feared he wasn't being, the man he worried his children saw him as. There was no mistaking the remorse in his voice when he admitted that while the world saw his characters as iconic, he often felt like they were just a smokescreen, colorful distractions from the emotional disarray within. He also revisited his childhood with a new clarity, explaining how much of his adult chaos had its roots in an unstable, often painful upbringing. He recalled nights filled with shouting, unpredictable moods, and the feeling of walking on eggshells in his own home. "You grow up thinking that kind of volatility is normal," he said, "so when it shows up in your adult life, you don't run from it, you welcome it, it feels familiar." The impact of that environment had left scars so deeply embedded that even years of success and therapy hadn't completely healed them. Instead, they festered quietly, manifesting in patterns of self-destruction and emotional withdrawal, and yet what shone through his confession wasn't hopelessness. It was a kind of weary determination. Depp seemed to have reached a point of self-awareness that was hard-won and overdue. He no longer wished to be seen as the erratic genius or the tragic celebrity. "I'm not interested in being a symbol," he said with finality. "I want to be real for myself and for my kids." The vulnerability in that statement underscored a man who had been through a crucible, not just of public judgment and legal warfare, but of private reckoning. He wasn't asking for redemption or applause. He was asking to be seen, not through the lens of tabloid sensationalism or Hollywood myth, but as a flawed, enduring father trying to make sense of what remains. Depp's relationship with Hollywood has always been complex, marked by both defiance and dependence. In this recent interview, however, there was a palpable sense of detachment. Not bitterness, but a quiet resolution. He spoke not as someone who felt rejected by the industry, but as someone who had finally decided to stop chasing its approval. He acknowledged that he never truly fit within the studio system and never wanted to. "I wasn't built for boardrooms," he said. "I never wanted to be part of a machine that valued trends over truth." What once might have sounded like arrogance now felt more like clarity, a veteran of the system finally able to speak from experience, not ego. His commentary on the current state of cinema was especially piercing. He criticized how art had become commodified, how algorithms now determined what stories got told, and how genuine risk-taking had been replaced by formulaic safety. "Everything's been focus grouped to death," he lamented, "and in the process, we've forgotten how to feel." This disconnect from the mainstream has only deepened his appreciation for the people who never left his side, his fans. Depp became visibly emotional when speaking about them, calling their unwavering support his lifeline. At the lowest points in his life, when public perception turned harsh and professional doors began to quietly close, he found solace in the letters and messages from strangers who believed in his humanity. "These people didn't know me personally," he said, "but they saw something in me worth defending. That kind of love, that's rare." He recounted opening envelopes filled with hand-drawn sketches, deeply personal notes and poems. Some came from fans who had endured their own traumas and saw in Depp's struggles a reflection of their own. These exchanges helped him feel less alone and rekindled his desire to create not for fame or validation, but as a way to connect and give back. The most poignant moment came at the interview's end. When asked what he would say to his younger self, that fresh-faced rebel stepping into the glare of fame in the late 1980s, Depp's expression softened. The pause before he answered felt like he was truly searching his soul. "I'd tell him it's going to be hard," he said, "but he'll get through it, and that even when it feels like the world is screaming lies about him, the truth will always win in the end." It was a tender acknowledgement of both his innocence and the trials that followed. There was no trace of anger, only an air of melancholy, acceptance, and gentle wisdom. In choosing to share this part of himself, Depp gave the world more than just another celebrity confession. He offered a rare look behind the layers, behind the stylized characters, the headlines, the scandals. What emerged was a portrait of a man who has walked through fire and emerged not unscathed, but alive and awake. He didn't offer easy answers or wrap his story in a bow. Instead, he gave us something much more meaningful: vulnerability without theatrics, regret without shame, and a glimmer of hard-earned hope. At 61, Johnny Depp no longer seeks to impress. He seeks to be understood. And perhaps for the first time, he finally understands himself. It wasn't just a confession. It was a release that seemed to unburden years of silent suffering. As Johnny Depp spoke, there was a noticeable shift in his demeanor, as though a weight he had carried for decades had finally been set down. Gone was the cryptic performer who once preferred to speak through characters and metaphors. In his place stood a man willing to be raw, direct, and heartbreakingly honest. For perhaps the first time in his public life, he wasn't trying to play a role, or meet an expectation, or even defend himself. He was simply telling the truth as he knew it, and in doing so, inviting the world to finally see him without the mask. What became clear in this vulnerable moment was how long he had lived behind a wall of self-preservation. The eccentricity, the mystique, the defiant interviews, and elusive public persona. It all served a purpose. It shielded him from being hurt again. It gave him control over a life that had, for too long, felt dictated by others. By directors, by studios, by headlines, and by the court of public opinion. He admitted that for years he feared what might happen if people saw the real man behind the characters. Would they understand him? Would they still admire him? Or worse, would they walk away? But the years of hiding had taken their toll. The constant pressure to perform, not just on set but in everyday life, had become unbearable. Something had to give. And finally, it did. In letting go, Depp reclaimed something he hadn't felt in years. His identity. Not the Hollywood-crafted image, not the misunderstood rebel, but the man who once dreamed of making music in a garage, who painted in silence, who cherished his children more than the spotlight. That man had been buried under decades of fame, trauma, and public scrutiny, but now, through the power of honest reflection, he was surfacing again. His voice may have trembled, but his words were steady, spoken with the conviction of someone who no longer needed to run or pretend. This wasn't about redemption in the traditional sense. It was about recognition, allowing himself to be seen not as a myth, but as a human being. In that moment, Johnny Depp reminded the world that even the most iconic figures carry invisible wounds, and sometimes the bravest thing they can do is simply let them show. Depp's journey of quiet restoration has been marked not by grand gestures or cinematic comebacks, but by deliberate, intimate choices that reflect a man seeking not attention, but authenticity. He described how the act of painting became more than just a hobby. It evolved into a deeply personal ritual. He would spend hours in silence, sometimes listening to old blues records or the rain outside his window, while brushing vibrant strokes across canvas. It wasn't about perfection or showing his work to the world. It was about reconnecting with the essence of who he had once been, before the world told him who to become. His portraits, often raw and textured, captured the spirits of people who had anchored him, not as celebrities, but as souls who had touched his life deeply. With each line I remembered, he said, not just them, but myself. Who I was with them, who I was before the noise. His late mother's portrait, he noted, was the most difficult, not because of technical skill, but because it forced him to confront both grief and gratitude at the same time. During the pandemic, as the world came to a halt, Depp found himself in a rare position: stillness. It was disorienting, he said, to wake up with no obligations, no scripts, no studios pulling him in different directions. At first the silence was deafening. He likened it to withdrawal, not from substances, but from identity. For the first time, no one was asking me to be Johnny Depp, he reflected, and I didn't know what to do with that. But slowly, day by day, that stillness began to feel like liberation. He wrote journals, revisited old songs, even reached out to people he had lost touch with. In that quiet space, he found a version of himself that had been buried under decades of performance, a version that valued stillness, sincerity, and connection more than accolades or applause. His reflections on aging were both tender and quietly revolutionary. He admitted that he had once feared becoming irrelevant, a relic of a wilder, more glamorous past, but now in his 60s he sees aging as a kind of rebirth. You stop caring about the mask, he said. You start valuing the face underneath. He no longer chases roles or media attention. Instead, he's investing in stories that feel true to him, projects that allow him to create without compromising his soul. Whether through a quiet film, a painting in a sunlit room, or a late-night jam session with old friends, Depp is beginning to find joy in creating for creation's sake. Perhaps the most poignant part of his recent revelations was his journey towards self-forgiveness, a process that seemed to underpin every word he spoke and every emotion he expressed. For much of his life, Johnny Depp had been a man at war with himself. The industry may have tried to define him, but the internal conflict, the struggle to reconcile who he was with who the world demanded him to be, ran far deeper. In his earlier interviews and public appearances, there had always been an undercurrent of defensiveness, even rebellion, as if he were constantly shielding himself from judgment. But now something had shifted. The defiance was gone, replaced by a quiet vulnerability that revealed a man no longer seeking to escape his past, but ready to understand and embrace it. He spoke about his younger self, not with scorn, as he once did, but with tenderness, as if looking at an old photograph of a boy who tried his best with the tools he had. He was lost, Depp said, voice low and reflective, but he fought. He kept going, and that counts for something. There was no attempt to downplay the missteps, the volatile relationships, the substance abuse, the erratic public behavior, but neither was there a need to magnify them into irredeemable sins. Instead, there was balance, a recognition that the same man who had made poor decisions was also the one who had created art that touched millions, loved deeply, and survived unimaginable scrutiny. This reframing of his own narrative wasn't just about healing, it was about rewriting the lens through which he viewed himself. For years, he admitted, he had looked at the mirror with resentment, not necessarily for what he saw, but for what he felt he had lost along the way. The purity of intention, the artistic integrity, the parts of his identity that had been slowly chipped away by decades in a business that often values conformity. Over authenticity, he had in many ways blamed himself for allowing Hollywood to mold him into something he didn't recognize. The teen idol of 21 Jump Street, the heartthrob of tabloid covers, the quirky caricature of roles like the Mad Hatter or Captain Jack Sparrow, all served a purpose, but each came at a personal cost. For a long time, he couldn't forgive himself for going along with it. But as he described in his recent interview, the years of pain had slowly given way to reflection, and reflection gave birth to something he hadn't felt in a long time: understanding. He spoke of self-forgiveness not as a singular moment, but as a slow, almost imperceptible process, one that began with small acts of kindness toward himself, waking up without expectations, picking up a paintbrush, writing letters he never sent, spending quiet evenings with his children. These simple, grounding moments gave him the space to look back with empathy instead of anger. One of the most moving aspects of this evolution was the way Depp described letting go of shame. "I used to carry it around like armor," he said. "Thought it would protect me from being hurt again, but all it did was keep people out." The shame, he explained, wasn't just about public scandal or career downturns. It was about feeling like he had failed the people he loved, particularly his children. He confessed that the weight of being Johnny Depp, the myth, the persona, had often left little room for being just dad. "I missed things, important things, and you don't get those back," he said. But rather than wallow in guilt, he now viewed those admissions as part of the human journey. A journey filled with imperfections, yes, but also with growth, resilience, and ultimately, love. His newfound gentleness extended beyond himself too. Depp appeared to be at a place where he could acknowledge the hurt others had caused him. Betrayal by colleagues, attacks by the media, the spectacle of the courtroom, without allowing that hurt to define him. He didn't excuse it, but he no longer let it control the narrative. There was no venom in his voice, only fatigue, and a quiet determination to move forward without dragging those old wounds with him. "I'm not angry anymore," he said, plainly. "There's no room for it. This ability to make peace with his past has clearly changed not just how he sees himself, but how he interacts with the world. There is less of a need to prove something, to reclaim status, or vindicate reputation. Instead, he is investing his energy into things that truly matter to him, art that speaks from the soul, relationships that offer mutual respect, and time that is spent meaningfully rather than performatively. In this way, he is redefining what success looks like. It's not the size of the role or the number of awards. It's being able to sit with yourself at the end of the day and not feel like you're hiding from anything. Johnny Depp's journey towards self-forgiveness is not just a personal milestone, it's a powerful testament to the idea that redemption doesn't come from outside validation, but from an internal shift in perspective. It is the quiet revolution of a man who has lived through chaos, survived scandal, and come out on the other side with a deeper sense of who he is. He no longer needs to be seen as a legend or a rebel or even a hero. Being human is enough. And in a world that so often demands perfection, that kind of honesty is perhaps the most radical act of all.